Okay, welcome back to the Movie Well Marathon. I'm Andrew.
I'm Mac.
Heck yeah. And we are at the end of another marathon. We are rounding out The Mummy. You could argue as to whether or not this one's actually a part of the series or
Yeah.
not. We'll talk about it. For the sake of conversation right now, I'm going to assume it is. Directed by Alex Kurtzman. Came out
hmm
June 9th, 2017. That's been a minute now. But yeah, I'm going to need a second, okay?
You gonna need a second?
I need a second, real quick. I in that I need to say something.
Okay.
I fucking hate this movie. So no, I'm not playing. I
Yeah, no, I
hate this
understand.
movie not just because it's bad, but because of what it did. I
Okay.
loved
Oh,
the
yes.
concept of the dark universe so goddamn much. I was so excited, and this movie killed it, took a shat on its grave, and it hurts me. It makes me mad. Sure, you could say they bit off more than they could chew with the amount of announcing and preparation they did for the Dark Universe, but I had complete and total faith that the Dark Universe was going to work. For anyone who doesn't know, real quick, Universal was going to do a cinematic universe based on their classic movie monsters, very similar to the MCU. This is 2017. This is like the MCU at its peak right now. Like Civil War just
Mhm.
came out. We're revving up for Infinity War and all that. And technically, the Universal monsters did this first. People like to talk about the MCU as the first real cinematic universe. Universal was doing it first with our Wolfman versus Frankenstein and Dracula meets the Wolfman and all that good stuff. So like to do it again, there's already a precedent for it. Awesome. Let's do it. They tried it with Dracula Untold, and that didn't do well, so they moved on. I almost wish we would have watched Dracula Untold before this because as far as a universe kicking off movie, it's so much better, and I like it a
Really?
lot, even though a lot of people don't like it. So and then they made a trailer announcing the Dark Universe using clips and footage from the old movies with this amazing score done by Danny Elfman just for this trailer and then with like the ending with the Dark Universe Universal logo and all that we have at the beginning of this movie. And this movie sucked so much shit that they didn't do anything else with it for the rest of time, and I'm so angry about it. I'm not like I catch myself because it's not like I wanted this movie universe to continue, but it's like it's so annoying. So yeah, after that, what do you think of it? It's bad, by
Well,
the way. It's also bad. Like the movie itself as a movie, I think it's bad. Anyway, what do you think of it?
I guess a quick note on the Dark Universe stuff. Maybe as like maybe a voice for like the everyman here. I don't care a whole lot about the Dark Universe thing. I do feel like it's kind of a cool concept. But as someone who, well, maybe not an everyman, as someone who's a fond of the literature version of the monsters, I could tell you that the way they were trying to set up a couple of them in this movie wasn't going to work out great for him anyway. But movie, like this movie specifically, The Mummy 2016 or 17
17.
with Tom Cruise, is I don't know. It's not like the worst movie I've ever seen. It looks nice. It has cool stunts sometimes. And there's like an attempt to do a mummy story in it, but it falls short of the like the aesthetic value and almost like pageantry of the first one.
It's a good way
It
to
doesn't
put it.
have any of the love of the like the history or the aesthetic at all. Instead
Mm-hmm.
of being gilded and gorgeous and detailed and like I mean even the later mummy movies all have this very rich set design and feeling where everything is it feels so detailed, like you're in a library or in a museum and it's just full of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And aesthetically, like beautiful stuff. It all works together to create the scene. And this is just like a very 2010 action movie aesthetic.
Mhm.
The light cuts and is clear, so it looks nice, but it's not the kind of vibe that these movies need to have. The amount
Mhm.
of like whimsy required for a mummy movie is really
Yes.
high. And
Thank
this one
you.
didn't have a
Thank you.
lot of the whimsy
No,
that it needed.
not
It
at
went
all.
like cold and clinical with some of the stuff, a little bit too maybe like creepy movie rather than like
Yes.
whimsical.
Yes.
And I feel like that showed in a number of things too. Like for example, and this is kind of cutting to the chase a little bit because this was something I was like, oh, I realized what my issue is with this is. I was having an issue with the visions. I was like,
Mhm.
why the vision storytelling tool is not working for me here. I'm usually not a
Yes.
huge like anti on that. Visions can be a fun way to incorporate supernatural whatever, right?
Mhm.
But I was really bothered by it in this film. One, because I felt like it came on too early, and then as they continue to use it, I was like, "It's still bothering me. Why is it bothering me?" And I think it's because that's how they learn about their situation, whereas in the previous ones, you actually had to do some reading to
Yeah,
figure it out,
there was
you
that as
know?
well.
Like, even in, like, the climax of The Mummy, the original one, they're reading hieroglyphics from a
Mhm.
text to figure out what they need to do to solve the issue. The story and the conflict is so closely intertwined with the academic angle of the story that if you take that academic angle out and it's just about a soldier and a clandestine secret organization who
Mhm.
are chasing things around and punching things and flying around and stabbing things, you lose what inherently is core to the Mummy series, in my opinion, which is the nerd of it all. Like, you
Uh-huh.
gotta have the nerd,
Yeah.
and it didn't feel like it had that. Ironically, for having multiple literary characters, it didn't have that.
Yeah. So, yes. And I noticed and agree with your aesthetic point. Um and I took issue with that on multiple fronts. Um so like you could argue there's a lot about the Brendan Fraser mummies that aren't technically accurate. But it's kind of like Jurassic Park and the T-Rex. You know, like we learned
Mhm.
around when Jurassic Park came out that yeah, he had feathers, but like it was the 90s, whatever. We move on. But like now, 2017, we knew way more. We know
Mhm.
that Egypt wasn't just rolling dunes of sand and a couple of pyramids. Like I took genuine issue with the fact that Egypt is like somehow more movie cliche Egypt in this one than
Yeah.
it is in the
Yeah.
ones in the 90s. Like we knew the pyramid like at this point we know that the pyramids were like white limestone. We know there was more around the towns because you know a bunch of their places in Egypt were built around the Nile. There was water there. That's why. Like there were places of lush
Mhm.
growth. And it's also like this movie kind of portrays Egypt in those visions like the pyramids are magnificent castles in the background. They're fucking tombs, guys. And like we know that now. They
Yeah.
aren't the magnificent thing you think. Like the other mummy movies have a bunch of monuments and shit. And even though a lot of them are related to like death and stuff, like we spend more time with those places. And also, the pyramids have nothing to do with this movie. And like that's like,
Yeah.
hey, we're in Egypt. Don't forget we're in Egypt. Here we go. We're like having picnics out on the sand with these tombs in the background. Like I took issue with that. And then what would you say is the difference between a mummy and a zombie? Because for me, one of the very few things is that they're from Egypt. And there's only, technically, I would argue, one fucking mummy in this movie. Because every other dead guy is either someone she kills and brings back to life, or it's a knight from the Crusades, which I would argue this is more of a zombie movie than it is a mummy movie. So like yeah, I took issue
Well,
aesthetically with a
was
few things,
actually
and the fact that sorry,
no,
I'm
I gotta jump on that. I gotta jump on that
yeah
because my note is they kind of went the vampire angle with
that
this mummy.
too.
Like,
Yes.
in the sense that, yes, the mummy from the previous films, which I guess would have to be like my core conception of what a
Yeah.
mummy monster usually does, because that's the one I'm familiar with. But like it did like kind of take body parts from other people and did have
Mhm.
a few like goons, I guess, like the priests and stuff, like, kind of were a part of all that. Um, but it was all a part of the history of the character. It wasn't able to sort of like turn thralls. Even the one human that was kind of on its side was through like a relationship that they had kind of built rather than through like persuasive supernatural means, right? So to have our mummy in this film um just straight up suck the life out of somebody and
Mhm.
then that person is now in their thrall,
That's a vampire.
that's a vampire.
Yeah,
And
good
then you
point.
think about like the sort of like they went kind of like sexual with her
I
predator nature
Oh
and
no.
the fact that there's such a heavy focus on getting her back in her coffin. This is just a vampire movie with
Yeah.
mummy wrappings.
Yeah. Also, I in my head I was calling it the American Mummy in London because there's a lot of American Werewolf in London in this because again, he sees his friend all decayed and ghostly, which is right out of American Werewolf in London. Like different reasons, but right out of there. So like there's very little mummy in this mummy movie.
Mhm.
And just while we're on this point as well, not only do they misrepresent Egypt, I think, we spend no time in Egypt. None. Except for the flashbacks. None. And I think we don't talk about that enough because I didn't think to appreciate that with the previous Mummy movies as we spend most of them in Egypt. But
Good point.
we kind of play with the the subtle nuance of like, yeah, Egypt was kind of ravaged by Crusaders and Europeans and all of that. So what are we gonna do? We're gonna do the same fucking thing and spend the entire movie in London. I have a side point to that as well that we'll put a pin in for now because that's a different rant. But
Mhm.
yeah, all that.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, it's just I think I have like two things about this movie that I like, and then the rest of it, I honestly feel like I could make a point about why it's bad. Just like the rest of it.
Yeah, hmm. I don't know. There's not a lot that I wrote down that I liked. I mean, it's worth mentioning, like in terms of like effort put in. There's effort put into this film. It's not just like put together and thrown together and put on a screen. The stunts in particular, they did stuff with that, but that's Tom Cruise. That's what Tom Cruise
What he
kind of like
likes to do.
brought
Yeah.
to the product, right? Like, and I don't know. I can't decide how I feel about the idea of her having control over the general undead area. I am not the kind of person because I know that the general rule of thumb when writing fictions with dueling mythologies is to allow each person's like personal beliefs to rule their system. Like, if you're a crusader, then you would go to the afterlife that you believe in. And if you're Egyptian from the time of the pharaohs, then you would go to the afterlife that you believe in. And there's not a lot of overlap between those. I don't necessarily think that needs to be a hard and fast rule in terms of like world building. So I kind of like the idea that, a god of the undead in one culture would have power or influence over the dead in other cultures. Um, that said, it wasn't really explored or explained. We don't really know why she is okay with unleashing the darkness of Set upon the world. I mean, like, sure,
That's yeah, I wanted to
she
talk
was
about that. Um
like, sure, she was about to be kind of overthrown, but if she wanted the throne, all she really had to do was be clever and commit a couple of clever assassinations, and she'd be on the throne.
yeah, no, I wanted to talk about that. There's nothing look, I'm not saying I would do it, but if I wanted to murder my family, I don't think I'd have to make a pact with Satan or
Yeah,
Set or Loki to just slice their throats. Like that's all
yeah,
you did, babe. Like that's all you
yeah.
did was slice them up, but you didn't need power to do that.
Yeah.
There's very little, like, I had said at the beginning of this that I'm assuming this is a continuation in the same world as the Mummies. I already regret saying that, because really this just does clearly seem like it's a reboot, and it's a shameful reboot, and it's worse reboot, because there's so much that's very much the same thing. The face in the sand, the way that she's mummified and everyone's scared of her, and the way she sucks the life out of people. It's all worse. Like, Imhotep is a crazy, powerful, vindictive son of a bitch whose motivations you understand. And it's kind of like Wanda in Multiverse of Madness. It's like, she doesn't want to rule anything. She just wants this one thing based on love. But, like, it's the process. It's the threat that she has that makes people want to stop her. Same thing with Imhotep. This is just, she wants to destroy the world. Well, why is that, Alex? Because I said so. It's like, oh, great. Yeah, sure. Okay, cool. Thanks. Yeah, I love that. That's wonderful. Why? Why? Also, the plan. What's the plan? There was no plan. And then Mr. Jekyll's plan.
Yeah.
We're going to bring the god of death into your body and then kill the god of death by killing you. Sir, you are already aware that doing that would make him, as she said, a living god. You think you're going to be able to kill him? There were so many assumptions made with that process, because he's not even a man god yet. He's just lightly cursed, and he's already loosely implied to be immortal. I don't think, that's a side note, just movie-wise, I don't think they do enough exploring that, because we just don't see how the plane crash doesn't kill him, and it implies that he's immortal right now. I would have liked to have seen more of that, like him getting shot or stabbed and not doing anything, like he's in this weird limbo.
That's true.
But, like, it implies right now that he can't be killed as is. Why do you think bringing a god into the mix is gonna make that better, sir?
Well, I think the dagger had something to do with it, the dagger of Osiris or something. But no, I agree. That's actually a pretty good segue. If I could just vent about Jekyll for a second.
You vent, and then I want to talk, because that's one of my only positives, but only to a point. So I want to hear what you got to say.
So I think I developed an opinion watching this film that I hadn't really held before, or at least I didn't realize I held this opinion before. I have fairly recently read Jekyll and Hyde, The Strange Case of Jekyll and Hyde, or really there's not that, but and it's very interesting to read it, because the whole thing is about essentially how fragile Jekyll's psyche is. I would have to go through a lot to explain it, but he was frustrated by having to live a morally upright life, which in the time and social status that he was, Victorian gentleman life, it would have been pretty strict. And so he creates this version of himself that'll go out and be able to cut loose essentially without remorse, and that's Hyde. And he has a good time at first. He's like, this is perfect. When I'm Jekyll, I don't have to feel responsible for the actions of Hyde, and Hyde doesn't feel responsible for the actions of Hyde. So it's perfect. But very, very quickly, he kind of spirals out of control. And at the end of the book, you get this big, long chapter that's the confession of Dr. Jekyll. And he tells the whole story from his perspective. Because actually, most of the book is told from the perspective of a lawyer called Mr. Utterson. And for some reason, they decided to make this version of Jekyll also a lawyer. We'll get to that. And so when you get to this big, long chapter at the end, that's Jekyll's perspective on the whole situation, what you really find is not necessarily the horror thriller ending that you might expect. It's much more of like this really tragic and horrifying end where you see this guy wrestle with his existential problems so directly that at the end, dude commits suicide. Like that's the end of the story. It's way more Bruce Banner than people tend to think it is. And this version
Mhm.
of Jekyll is so like poorly but calculated and in control, and he knows exactly what he's doing. Um, and it's like their interpretation of the character, Hyde being a little bit younger, having actual physical changes, his attitude and sort of like, hey, let's make a deal. All of those things with Hyde and those details do match what's in the text, but their interpretation of Jekyll in particular is, I think, a real issue. I have come to the conclusion that Dr. Jekyll could not be a mastermind for anything, because the one idea that this guy had that he had was powerful enough to pull off, he ruined his entire life over,
Aha.
including several other lives along the way,
Yeah.
and feels so incredibly guilty about it that he has a huge identity crisis, locks himself in a room, and eventually kills himself.
Mhm.
So, like, I cannot accept him as the leader of a clandestine
No,
organization.
absolutely not.
Sorry. Can't
Absolutely
do
not.
it.
So yes, I love that analysis. I want to hop on for a second if I may.
Yeah,
I don't disagree, honestly, with anything you've said, but with the rest of the turd that sequence is wrapped in, the Mr. Hyde's sequence,
mhm,
I don't know. It's the one part that I kind of enjoy because I think it's actually interesting. I I have read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I
mhm,
haven't taken as close a look at it as you have, and I've spent more time with the Hulk versions of it.
sure.
So I kind of like a middle ground. I don't
Mhm,
necessarily want the Van Helsing version, which is just the Hulk, or the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which is just the Hulk but worse.
mhm,
So I like this one that's kind of like Split, the James McAvoy movie. I like the idea of there being the different identity that causes very subtle physical differences. Granted, he's
mhm.
got superhuman strength, but like his hand grows a little more than I personally would like. But I like the idea of maybe his fingerprints change. I love that his eyes are just what a predator's looks like in the nighttime, which is not something humans can do. So I like that it's only there for Mr. Hyde, and I like the veins. And then that part where Nick kicks him and he spits the blood on the glass wall and his laugh just gets deeper and deeper and deeper. I love that. I just do.
Mhm.
I love it. That being said, that's it. I don't necessarily love the casting because
Mhm.
with what you said as far as like the Victorian age thing, can you imagine that Dr. Jekyll is there, a part of it, but it is more of a Bruce Banner kind of thing? It's like Hugh Grant, like the very up and tight, British guy who's like then has the hide thing that we can mess with and work around. Because here's the thing, I don't have an issue with Prodigium necessarily. In Van
Mhm.
Helsing, we have our organization that fights monsters. In The Mummy, we have the Magi, our organization that fights
Right.
monsters. I'm okay with there being the Dark Universe Shield, which is what this is. I'm okay with there being a Dark Universe Nick Fury, but he already exists, and it is Van Helsing, not Hugh Jackman. The Van Helsing in the original Dracula is an older gentleman who's an expert on monsters and shit, and I think that they should have done that. Van Helsing should have been the
Yep.
guy who's in charge of all this. Like, that would have been amazing and accurate to the source material. I really would have preferred that. That being
Although it really, really would have just been a vampire movie then.
Oh no, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. I'm thinking a little bit, world building. I think it'd be better to remove Dr.
Right.
Jekyll entirely. As it is, I
Yes,
think it would
correct.
have been slightly more interesting and less kind of dumb if we've already established that Aminet is in Nick's head. It would have been
Mhm.
so cool if we had had time after time where Jekyll is using the injector and putting Hyde away, and then Aminet starts acting through Nick, and he snaps, and he's like, well, shit. Give me the other serum. And that guy's like, what? No. It's like, yeah. Because that's the only thing that can fight him, and you know it. Now you have to be ready for when I take him out, you got to be ready to take me out. And then we actually have a fight that is Jekyll versus, because like the whole sequence, honestly, at the end of the day, is stupid. It's pointless. It's not necessary. And then we have Jenny fighting the other good guy, and they're like fighting back to back. Like, oh, don't you love when fight scenes have like people doing the same thing at different times? He's trying to save your ass, and you're fighting him, and then you knock his head out with the Book of Amun Ra, which references. Like, no, it would have been cool if Hyde had to fight Nick, and we got more of like a because like Amulet's acting through Nick because he's evil. Okay, cool. Let's see some of that, because we don't get any of that at all.
I mean, I think the moment, like, there are times in this movie where it almost has something, where, like, he says, she's not in my head, and then they look up, and he's driving back
Right, exactly.
her.
Like, they do show that it's
cool
there.
Moment.
Right, but that's it. That's all we get. That and the communication thing.
There are moments where, like, the small bits of, like, the right kind of humor shows through. Like, and this might be a soft spot that I have for the actor, because I love New Girl, but Jake Johnson,
Yes.
as whatever the guy's name is, Chris Bale, I felt like he did a really good job. His writing wasn't always very good. Like, sometimes the character was like showing up in like like kind of speaking in a weird way, but the whole sort of like, I'm your best friend hanging out, telling you that, you know, I felt like it was a cool interpretation of like the first movie's Benny character. Like it was something. But then I hated Jen Halsey. Like, what is it, Jennifer Halsey? Like the love interest in this movie.
Yeah.
She was such a pale comparison. And like, particularly like her interactions with Nick and how they like wanted us to see the chemistry right away.
There was no chemistry.
But like,
there's nothing.
There was no chemistry.
No.
These characters.
That was a pitiful excuse for a love story. It was ridiculous. There's more chemistry between Nick and Aminet, which is dumb.
Yeah.
Like, for him to be all upset and bring her back to life, it's stupid. It was just stupid. There was nothing there. All she ends up becoming is a damsel in distress over and over and over again. Her motivation isn't all that interesting. It doesn't make sense at all for this organization to be what it is, that is Prodigium, and send her out there by herself, where there's also like an active war situation going on, which is like unrelated to this. There's also like, it's just, I want to focus on that just for a second. Prodigium, again, with their involvement, what they do and where they're at and how big they are. They're the real deal. They're not like a fringe group or anything. They're like legit. And
they got goons.
They got goons, they got pulled, they got resources. They are actively dealing with real monsters. We get references to the creature from the Black Lagoon and Dracula, or at least vampires. And you didn't maybe think to use any paranormal weapons against the mummy? I know you have them. Okay. I know you have them. And then also, it's kind of interesting for a second to see that Dr. Jekyll's office has the barn door protocol that the Avengers Mansion does for if Mr. Hyde freaks out. That's good planning. Then you think about how, actually, you know what? Maybe it's not the best idea ever to have our monster headquarters where we bring the mummy in the middle of London.
Yeah, no, that was a thought. When they started driving the truck like into London, I was like, you are taking the dangerous thing into the heart of the city. It's something that happens more than a few times in action films, but like it's a critique that I feel like pretty much always stands. There might be a few exceptions, but largely, if you take something you know to be incredibly dangerous into the heart of a city, you are not a hero. No. You are not thinking things through. Like you gotta try again.
Yeah, and it's a little much, but at this point the movie's not good, so who cares? It should have been Castle Dracula, or my personal preference, Castle Frankenstein. If you wanted to have some sort of great big space / property that's out in the middle of nowhere that has another reference to a different Dark Universe property or a different monster, it should have been Castle Dracula or Castle Frankenstein. That would have been amazing.
With this whole like new action movie style thing, like, sure, this is kind of sci-fi, but this is way more gothic than it is sci-fi. Take advantage of the fact that you are in Europe and do something gothic and fun in your Dark Universe thing.
Yes. God, yeah. So there's all that. I do. Okay, we should focus a little bit on the things that
Mm,
matter.
mm.
Don't know how to do that just yet.
I'm not sure what matters in this film.
Yeah. Well, okay, so we're talking a lot about the lack of whimsy, the like poor chemistry, the aesthetic isn't great, a lot of things don't make sense, like world building. Structurally, real quick, the writing is weak. There's
Mhm.
not a lot of things that make sense, as we've already talked about. You didn't need to summon a god to kill your younger brother. That's pretty easy. Um, Character motivations, I think, are a little bit all over the place. They really want us to like Nick. Don't know why. He's a tool. They don't like. He's not even close to Ricochet O'Connell. Like, and he clearly was supposed to be. He's not.
Mhm. Mhm.
They do shit with
There's this
Jenny.
very forced dialogue or theme
Oh yeah,
between him and Jenny about like, "You're a good man," or "You have a good heart. It's right underneath the surface." It's like,
yeah. No.
show through actions, man.
Yes,
Stop.
please. Um, God. And you did touch on it for a second. I do want to circle back to it as well because this being the first movie where the mummy is a woman and she's like the main antagonist and all that, it is upsetting how sexualized she is throughout the film. Surprising? No. Upsetting? Yes, because she has the potential, I think, to be a pretty awesome monster just by
Mhm.
herself. I dig some of it, like the weird Sanskrit is
Mhm.
interesting. The way the bandages are like embedded in her skin is kind of cool. Um,
Actually, questions about the writing on her skin because it's not Sanskrit. I'm pretty sure it's Cubism or
oh
cube,
yeah,
whatever they
whatever.
call it. But that's like one of the earliest forms of writing, which does kind of come out of Mesopotamia, but like, would they have used it in
No
Egyptian
idea.
ritual?
No idea. Not a clue. Yeah. There's also I don't like that she has hair because she wouldn't. A lot of Egyptians, especially royalty, they shaved their heads and wore wigs. So she wouldn't have this long, flowing, sexy lady hair that she does throughout the movie. That's just not a thing. That would. And then I don't get why she can sense where the dagger is, but not where the ruby is. Can't sense that it's broken up, but sure, why not? Fine.
Spices, man.
Yeah. So I don't.
Um,
Yeah.
I guess
It's
I
just.
kind of want to the sexualization of the mummy in this. I feel like it is a little bit more complex than you would normally talk about this sort of thing with action films because the sexualization of female characters in action films is primarily an issue because it reduces the agency of the character more often than
Mm-hmm.
not. In a monster story, sexuality is often a part of the story. Like it's a part of the theme, it's a part of what it's saying about the world. You even kind of can see it in the early like the original Mummy movie where the whole motivation of our character is love and they were having like an affair and you kind of see that between you get that kind of same energy sometimes between Rick and Evie. Like it's present in the story and it's a part of the story. So it's not like I would want to remove that entirely. It's just that it feels very different in this film than it does in those because rather than it's messed up, but Imhotep is doing this stuff out of like an actual kind of love,
Right.
whereas this is just like there's no relationship previously
Mm-mm.
established between Amunet and the person she was going to sacrifice to Set. All of her actions are extremely sort of like sexualized. There's moments where she's like basically sexually assaulting Nick
Mm-hmm.
like in the church on the temple, and
Mm-hmm.
I can't tell if they're trying to play that scene for jokes or not.
Yeah, because right
Um,
after that, they all turn their heads at the same time, and Jenny's speechless. Was like, okay, is this funny or not? Like, what's.
yeah, it felt weird because that moment could have landed if it was clearer what the tone before that moment was, but it wasn't. And I can't, I think it's a directing issue because I think the actors were playing it as like everyone is freaking out, no one knows what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, like as an audience member, I'm sitting there, I'm like, am I scared? Are we
Right.
belittling the mummy because she's a woman and she's using sexuality? Is it something that's actually dangerous, a threat? Like, I don't understand what the tone of this moment is supposed to be. And so
Mhm.
I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't mind that sexuality was used in the story. I dislike how it was
Yeah,
used. It
absolutely.
feels
Because
cheap and showmanshipy rather than actually saying something about anything.
yeah, well, because I mean, Emotep and Anoxina Moon are walking around almost naked throughout
Yeah.
their movies, but it's more often than not like there's not unnecessary emphasis put on it. We don't get
Mhm.
unnecessary like butt or crotch shots of Emotep. He doesn't have to kiss the people to suck the life out of them.
Mhm.
He's not
Mhm.
licking people. Like it was what you said. Like un it was not done well, and with the way they handle the lore slash the magic, it comes across more vampire-y. Like
Yeah.
you're failing all over the place.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then yeah,
If
the
a
love
movie
aspect with
is
Nick in the
more
end is weird because
yeah.
why?
It's just Twilight at that point.
Ugh, 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 yuck, gross.
Mm.
Don't like it. I don't like it at all. I just yeah. Also, I did. This is kind of a nitpick, but I think another testament to the film as a whole is just kind of sloppy. The car sequence with the ambulance when they're driving away, he's doing his donuts and driving real fast. We're getting screech like any other regular chasing. He's driving on dirt.
Mm.
There, none of those sounds would exist, and I don't think it would have hurt the movie to incorporate that. And
If they had made the sound effects a little bit more realistic, it would have actually been way more grounding for the setting.
I think so too. And I know most people won't notice that, but I was thinking about it when he does he does a wraparound and it's just loud rubber on pavement screeching, and I'm like, you're driving in mud. So
Yeah.
cool, good to know. Um, yeah. And then
Actually might be a great way to sort of encapsulate the core issues of this film. It's just like the moment could have been cool, but you were
yeah,
trying so hard to make it a Mission Impossible film that you forgot what you were actually writing.
yeah. Oh, I guess real quick on that for a second. I am aware of a bias here. I don't like Tom Cruise at all.
Mhm.
However, I still don't think he does well in this movie. I don't think he
Agreed.
was a good
I
choice. I do, despite my issues with Tom Cruise as an actor and as a person, I like him in Edge of Tomorrow. I
Mhm.
like a lot. So I know he can act, and I know my bias only has a certain extent. In this, it was a bizarre choice. They even have a moment, and like I think Honest Trailers pointed this out, but it always resonated with me because I thought it was funny. Dr. Jekyll slash Mr. Hyde refer to him as a younger man. He's like 54, and like Tom Holland being 25 playing an 18-year-old is one thing. I don't know how young they want us to think Nick is in this movie, but it's portrayed like he's a early 30s renegade out there in the world stealing shit, doing his thing. Dude, you're in your
Right.
50s. And you don't look like you're not in your 50s.
I had just interpreted that as like Jekyll being older than he should be, in the sense that Jekyll's around from the 1800s. But
I don't even think that's what it is, though. That's the thing. I
I think
think
you're wrong.
I don't. I do wonder about that too. I think there is a little bit of that, and not as many people are going to care about this. I'm segueing now into a different point. Not many people will care about this, and it doesn't necessarily affect the movie. However, when you are embarking on a cinematic universe, your continuity and consistency and the outreach and the lore does matter a little bit because
Sure.
it's one of your goals here. So to do this movie and to have Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and we're referencing Dracula, and we're referencing the creature from the Black Lagoon, and who knows what else is technically in Prodigium that I didn't catch. I like to think that all that shit on the wall isn't actually Jekyll's, but like Frankenstein's. I just like to think for fun.
Mm-hmm.
So like
It would make sense why it was so like bone
I
designed. It was designed
know.
for
And that
bone.
one
Yeah.
skull that's like got the top part like technically
Mhm.
removed, like I don't know, I just like to think it's Frankenstein's. But like to do that, it's like the first movie in the MCU is the Avengers with only Cap and Nick Fury. and maybe
Yeah.
Black Widow. It's like, well, I feel like
Yeah.
we've missed a bunch of stuff here. Like, we've already had adventures with vampires, and we've already had adventures with the creature from the Black Lagoon. Like, where are we going with this now? And
Mhm.
you mentioned, like, well, Dr. Jekyll, he's from the 1800s. I wondered about that too, because they cast Frankenstein and the Bride of Frankenstein and the Invisible Man and all of that before they made those movies. So now I'm wondering, okay, it's like, are these other movies prequels? Or are we getting this reinterpretation of them in the modern day? And if so, what have we been fighting for all this time, if not these classic
Mhm.
monsters? What are we doing? You skipped the foundation of this house entirely and went right to the second floor. And that's not gonna work,
Yeah.
man. Like you went way too far, way too quick with things that
Yeah.
aren't working.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's I can see why it killed the cinematic universe. I'll put it that way.
It's a real shame. It's a
Yeah.
real shame. And then yeah, in the
I would
end,
love to see a modern interpretation. Well, actually, I was gonna say I'd love to see a modern interpretation of Frankenstein. It's it's a almost satirical take, but or maybe more parody would be the word. Lisa Frankenstein's not bad. Um
mm, I was gonna say Vision. Vision is basically Frankenstein. I mean that is the metaphor in Age of Ultron, and I like it. I dig it a lot, honestly.
there is something to be studied, almost certainly has been studied, about how the superhero vehicle has taken over most of our like
Hmm.
mythologies and legends. You find a ton of Greek mythology in superhero stuff,
Oh, absolutely.
Roman mythology too. You find a whole bunch of like how we progress as a society in comic books. This is a digression. I don't know. I was just thinking out loud about all
No, I mean
that.
I get it, and I agree. But yeah. Oh, also, just real quick, again, members of Prodigium that could have been. Dr. Jekyll says to a new world of gods and monsters, which was the big title moment of the trailer they made. That line is said probably somewhere in one of the books, but in the movies it is said by Dr. Pretorius, which is the other scientist that inspired Frankenstein, who helps build the bride, and he makes all kinds of other monsters. He's crazy. He's amazing, and he's a metaphor for a lot of stuff in the original movie. So, like, again, it would have been interesting if Prodigium was made up of Van Helsing, Dr. Jekyll, and Dr. Pretorius. This
Mhm.
range of what's that saying? They use it in D&D all the time. Allegiance, alignments, chaotic neutrals and lawful goods and all that. Like
Yeah.
this array of perspectives, and but all brilliant scientists as well. Like it would have been really cool to do that, but instead, as you indicated, they made Jekyll like this amalgamation, which is weird. It's a
You
weird
really
choice.
you gotta really understand the mad scientist if you're gonna do a monster universe. And by that I mean mad scientists are all connected by the sense that they take out their own personal issues in science and then make it everybody else's problem. But that means that it's also incredibly personal to the character. Not every mad scientist builds a giant robot. Sometimes
Hmm.
it's, like Jekyll's instinct to experiment on himself so that he can experience a different side of life without guilt is a completely different psychosis from Frankenstein, who's over here cutting cadavers up and sewing them together and being like, I am the creator of life,
Hmm.
like it's a different vibe. And you gotta understand those in order to accurately tell their stories, because it is like those attitudes are at the crux of what those stories are trying to communicate to the reader. Arguably, you could take the same ideas and icons and write a new story with them, one that you think might fit better for the masses, but then you're not going to actually be using that mythology. You're not going to be actually using that story. Frankenstein is alternatively titled the modern Prometheus for a reason, right? You have to have that kind of cultural understanding of the stories in order to accurately interpret them and bring them to the screen. And I think audiences will like it.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
absolutely.
not gonna be, maybe as mass, like a super popular film,
Mhm.
but you'll have your corner of the market, and people will buy in if you're
Mm-hmm.
doing well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think an action-driven version of the Dark Universe absolutely could have worked. However, to your point, I don't think the more cerebral approach would have hurt it because
Hmm.
none of them are connected. But the Invisible Man, the most recent one, kicked ass and it was great. And they went after a more psychological thriller aspect of it. There
Hmm.
was nuance. They approached it from a woman's perspective because of the gaslighting and the real world experience with abuse. Like it's fantastic. And then The Shape of Water, weird as hell. And again, not connected to anything, but it's loosely implied to be the creature from the Black Lagoon. Fantastic movie, absolutely fantastic. There's like half an action sequence. So like, it could have been done. It
Hmm.
could have been done. It could
I
have been
guess
done.
maybe the one thing we're missing is, and I don't mean to generalize too much, but am I wrong in thinking that the audiences that would largely be interested in these stories would be women?
I don't know. I mean, probably like I would argue at the end of the day probably not.
No? Okay.
Well, for those two examples, yes, the
Mhm.
protagonist of both those they are women. But I think I don't know if that's necessary. That's definitely not a bad thing, and you don't have to do that for all of them. And I think that could just be. I think that's more of a coincidence that for both those movies, the antagonist is a toxic example of a man. That's not going to be every single one of our movies, but that does happen to be in the lore. That is the Invisible Man and the Creature from the Black Lagoon. There are examples of toxicity in those, and it was interesting to see a modern day take to it. You don't necessarily have to have that in the Wolf Man or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Well, that might be a bad example, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But actually, the more I talk about it now, all of our classic monster movies have incredibly toxic male representations because that's kind of their thing. But I don't think it's, to your point, even if it did appeal to women more specifically, I don't think that's a bad thing, and that's not. I mean, look at.
My thought process was male audiences stereotypically
Mhm.
go for the simple films that are filled with flashy action and adventure, whereas women's films stereotypically tend to go with the more cerebral stories. Even if they are dramas, more is happening in the abstract than in the physical world, right?
Mhm.
It's about relationships, it's about the consequences of actions. And this, I mean, I'm thinking in particular with Frankenstein, the fact that, like, Mary Shelley wrote it,
Mhm.
and just sort of like how it's all about it's all about examining the flaws of culture, in particular, those in power, and so that kinda lines up with, like you were saying, incredibly toxic male leads,
Mhm.
largely because they were the ones who were in power and had
Right.
the terrifying influence to make these sorts of decisions, right? Um, and so it's like, kind of by default, potentially, a more cerebral take on these monsters would be seen as something that's only for women, or maybe would be more popular with women than it would be with men, stereotypically, and I'm kinda guessing at a lot here, so I could be totally off the mark, but if that's the case, they wouldn't market it. They wouldn't actually try to promote it, because if it's for women, the only way that executives understand that is it's either a girl film or it's romance, and
Mhm.
that's really disappointing. I mean, I'm thinking about sort of big picture stuff now, like, kind of far-reaching networking consequences. There are cartoons that get canceled when they get too
Oh
many
yeah.
girl viewerships
Right.
because they wanna split the market and they wanna force girls into, like, their side and boys into their side, and so, like, I'm wondering if maybe they feel like they have to take the action angle on these films in order to make money because they don't think that it will be profitable, or that they'll be catering to their audience, quote, unquote, "their audience," if
Mhm.
they take it the cerebral route. Which is really funny because the reason everybody still likes The Mummy today
Uh huh.
is because it's cerebral. I mean, it's
Right.
not like the most clever film ever made, but it's about the academic fun of it.
I don't know. I think technically you are right, but again, the more I think about it, going back to the roots, which is what this was supposed to be, a modern day representation of the shared universe of the monsters. The roots are cerebral, even though audiences may not have known that. Frankenstein, the whole thing is that he's not a monster. He is the victim in many
Right.
ways. And then the Invisible Man, that's an exploration of how, of all the monsters these movies have made, humanity is the worst one. The creature in The Creature from the Black Lagoon is tragic and is just looking for companionship or a mate. He doesn't know that he's doing terrible things. The Mummy, the original Mummy, is doing what Imhotep wanted to do, which is bring back his love. So like,
Mm-hmm.
and then the Wolfman again is tragic. He has very little control over it. There's something similar to explore there with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Like, there's a cerebral aspect to all of them. You know, they aren't the Blob. These classic guys, there was a lot to them. So
Mm-hmm.
I think there is a way that you could have done it where you could have had some cool action. You could have had the cerebral, and you could have had where like maybe this is subtly targeted. Well, it is made in mind, many of them from the perspective of a woman, we'll say, since so many of them do have that strong aspect, and those two that have done it have worked really well. But it's marketed as just the monster movie, and then you watch it, and some of them will walk away being like, well, there's a lot of woman stuff in it. It's like, well, shut up. It's 50% of the population. It's going to happen.
Saying to make them all feminist takes at the same story. I'm just saying that when we're looking at the round, like the numbers of everything, like the executives would be,
Mm-hmm.
um, it doesn't pay to make a film thoughtful these days.
Mm-hmm.
It does pay to make a good film. And I think there are exceptions. Like I would argue, kind of, this is actually a good example in my opinion because of what kind of story we're talking about. Black Panther, the first one, that's a film with a crazy, like it's a message, very clear, cut through.
Mm-hmm.
There's content to it. There's cerebral elements of it while it's still a fun, flashy action movie. Um, and that's kind of what I'm looking for, but where you would prioritize that internal emotional angst rather than the action of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think even just suggesting the idea that the story is more about the character than it is about the conflict
Mm-hmm.
or the physical conflict, then I think you like the executives start feeling like that's not the kind of movie that's going to make them money. And
Maybe.
that's inherently a problem in my opinion
Oh,
with
absolutely.
these stories because
Mm-hmm.
it is about the internal character angst and how that reflects upon society, and if you are going to make monster films without that, they're just going to be flash and spectacle and they're not going to have anything of value
Right.
to them.
So your greater point here is that the Dark Universe was doomed from the beginning because they were never going to do it right.
Unless they were really going to buckle down and actually tell the gothic elements of these stories, which is what I've been talking about, the angst and stuff, then I don't think it would have been that good. I think they could have potentially made some money, but it would not have been the kind of the kind of good that I would want out of
Mm-hmm.
that universe, where there's actually something going on and it's not just, "Oh no, I made a thing," or "I drank the wrong serum,"
Right.
or "There's a monster in the forest." Like, I want more than that.
Right. I don't blame you. We're technically at our time, and I had two more things I just want to mention real quick. Um, I don't really get why him becoming a death god is a good thing, and why a human can fight off the influence of the death god. But
Sure,
whatever,
'cause why
man.
not, right?
Sure, yeah, why not? Just go ahead, fucking do it. Um, and then I did have another one, and I've already forgotten it because it's just they did a lot of the in plane stunts, like for real. Cool, good for them. You don't really do a whole lot with it, so I don't know how necessary that was. Um,
Drive home my point. I feel like this is an example of a film that's made with the
unnecessary,
spectacle
actually.
of the
Yeah.
monster without
Oh,
the angst of the monster, you
yeah.
know? So,
Absolutely, absolutely.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I don't remember what my other point was. Probably something about it just not being good, which is, the the bulk of the movie. I just had it and then I lost it again. Yeah, it doesn't matter. It's not good. Tis not a whale. It's bad.
Um,
It's really unfortunate. Um, On to the next, I guess. I will forever be annoyed though, 'cause I do think that the Dark Universe had potential. It had so
sure.
much potential, And like we're getting good monster movies now. It's just such a shame that they couldn't figure their shit out earlier. I would love to see them all interacting and crossing paths, but whatever. You got any final things to say?
I don't know. Maybe do your research before you make a monster movie.
Seriously. I mean, research anything. This isn't good as a Mummy reboot. This isn't good
No.
as a monster movie. This isn't good as an Egyptian, like an ancient Egyptian mythology movie. Like, this is just bad. This isn't good as an
Not
action
even
movie.
good as
Like,
like a spy movie. Like it's kind of got a
no.
spy espionage thing going on. It's not even good as that.
No, it really, really. Oh, that was my other point. Sorry. So scared of Aminet that we put her in a pool of mercury, buried underground for her to never be risen again. Why do you have a mechanism that'll bring her out of the mercury? What are you gonna
Yeah.
bring her out for? Holidays? Like, I mean, why would you do that? They didn't do that with Emotep. They had to go dig that fucker up. There's no reason that Aminet should have had a mechanism that would have pulled her out of the mercury. That's dumb. That's really dumb. And I don't think it would have
What's
been.
even more confusing is in her audio notes when she's looking at the mechanism, she says something to the effect of like, it looks like a pulley system, but it looks like it's supposed to hold the thing down rather than let it like pull it up. But then like a minute later, he
It
shoots
pulls
a
it up.
rope and it pulls it up.
Right, like what does
So
that mean? That doesn't make any sense. And I don't think it would have hurt the movie to be like, there must be something down there and cut to them just like excavating it. Why do there have to be bogeys incoming and we have to leave really, really quick? Like, you don't have to do that. Anyway.
you do.
Awful movie. 'Tis Not a Whale. I hated it. I'm excited for the next marathon.
Yeah.
Little bit of a buffer between the marathon, but you'll just have to wait to see what that is next week. Woohoo!
Have fun.
Yep, alright, bye.